Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has her PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature. Her current research focuses on modernist and contemporary poetry. She's also the editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, part of Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and the author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, a collection of essays about the importance of walking, being female while doing it, and the social commentary that emerges from it. Tanis is also a very active and vocal advocate for the study and support of contemporary Canadian poets. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This final episode of our four-part series features a wide-ranging discussion that touches on how you can keep tabs on contemporary writers, Tanis's own Watershed Writers podcast, which focuses on hyperlocal literature, and her latest book, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. I'm curious, just from a practical standpoint, how do you keep tabs on what's happening in contemporary poetry, discovering new writers and so on?
I rely largely on my very, very well-read friends. Also, my own publishers of my own poetry, Jay and Hazel Miller, who run Book Hug Press. I just saw them at an event called Sharp Words in Hamilton, and I just literally went to them and said, what do you got that I'm going to like? What do you got that I need to read? Mm-hmm. And they said, buy these books, right? And they gave me a good deal on it because I bought several. And I'm a huge library user as well. I have to be a huge library user, or else I wouldn't be able to move. I have my own many books.
Right.
So I do that. I also listen to who my students are reading. Mm-hmm. And I think I find more fiction that way, but sometimes poetry. Mm-hmm. It's helpful to go to just do do what lots of people do, is to go to a literary festival and hear people read. Mm-hmm. Right. I also, speaking of being an advocate for poetry, if I'm in a new bookstore, I always say, where's your poetry section? And if it's this big, I go, wow, all those poets, eh? Right. And so I'm known to be a little sarcastic.
Yeah.
And just say, you know what? But what I often tell booksellers who have a small poetry section is people who read poetry buy it. Mm-hmm. Right. Because they know they can't always get it everywhere, so they buy it. So by say doubling that tiny section, so instead of 10 poets stock 20, automatically your sales are going to go up.
Sure.
Because people want to own it to reread it. Mm-hmm. Whereas a novel, sometimes, I read a novel, I think that was good, and then I return it to the library. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I read a book of poetry from the library and I think, I have to own this because I will be looking up that poem over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Because poetry is meant to be reread, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious. I was just thinking about that. I think people tend to also give, they'll buy a novel and then give it to somebody else to read. I don't know if that happens with poetry volumes or not, but or if people tend to hang on to them because of, like you say, they want to reread them, and they become fairly special.
Yeah, I think generally they do hang on to them. Mm-hmm. Although often and I'll tell you, this is exactly how much of a bibliophile I am. If I'm, say, at like a book sale, often a fundraiser, like of used books, mm-hmm. and I go and I find poetry books that I love but I own, I buy it anyway because I think I know someone who needs this.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a whole shelf of stuff just to give away to a person who says, hey, so were there any, feminist Canadian poets in the 1950s? I go, why, yes. And here's this copy of J. McPherson's The Boatman. Right. Enjoy. Right. So Yeah, and again, because they do go out of print, and so it matters that I have a physical object I can give to someone, right,
Yeah.
and say, "Yeah, read this."
Yeah. Excellent. So if the Laurier series so far has, made it part of its mission is to preserve the last generation of writers, and you touched on this a little bit, but how will it continue forward doing the same for, future generations?
My introduction to the series suggests that who gets published is always a political matter, and whose works stay in print is a
Yeah.
political matter, and that there. Speaking of being out of line, there are fantastic poets whose work has gone almost ignored, or at least have not received the kinds of accolades or the kind of publications that they should.
Hmm.
And so when someone like, Nduko Otiono came to me and said, "Hey, listen, I've got these books that are out of print, and I've been in Canada for 8 years. I think it's 8 years now, maybe 10. And what do you think about having me in this series?" I said, "Yeah, let's talk about that," because I thought I didn't know him.
Hmm.
I hadn't read his work, but again, that's for exactly the reasons that I was talking about. There's systemic racism. There is the fact that things go out of print. There's the fact that he was a new Canadian. All of these things,
Right.
right? So I said, "Yeah, send me those poems, and we'll talk about it," because I think that's part of what the series needs to be doing is broadening its base, is having more BIPOC writers, having more LGBTQ poets, etc. Right. So if in some ways uh, Brian and Neil were concentrating on the fact that there's a generation of poets whose work needed to be preserved because they were aging out, mine is, yeah, and there's a generation of poets that need to be preserved because there have been all kinds of systemic ignorance that hasn't kept them in print,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And that's what I meant by Lillian Allen, right?
Hmm.
And Marilyn Dumas, the Métis Cree writer,
Hmm.
who has always been very successful in terms of having her poetry published. But again, it's to get it's something else to have a selected where you can look at what she has done
Hmm.
and how her poetry has influenced, a generation of Indigenous writers. So yes, that's what I'm doing.
Right.
That's the future of the series for me.
Excellent. Excellent. So you're no stranger to the podcast format yourself. So can you talk about your Watershed Writers podcast? It's got a very interesting focus on hyperlocal literature.
It grew out of the fact that I was invited to give a talk about Out of Line
Mm.
at a local arts place, and former CBC and BBC radio producer Frances Roberts Riley was in the audience. And Frances is retired, but she has more energy than like a person a third of her age. So she says, "Let's put together a podcast." Because one thing I had done when I was talking is I gave this long list of writers who lived in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. Many of them have been nominated for huge national awards. Some of them have won them. And this idea that we're all in this small city being sort of, hiding under a cabbage leaf and being sort of very retired and far from Toronto, I thought, nah. No, I don't think that's it. And so I said in my talk, yeah, you want to talk about writers? There's Tomas DeBose and Carrie Snyder and Heather Smith. And I just went on, and Aaron Bow. And I'm in my big list. And she said, "Well, that's a podcast.
Hmm.
We can do a radio documentary about writers in the area." And I really liked this idea that it would be exclusive to the area,
Hmm.
because I think, okay, we're out of line writers. Let's make it happen,
Hmm.
right? And so she brought all the technical expertise and understanding about how to build that. And Brendan Highmore, the late Brendan Highmore, who sadly has passed away a year and a half ago, was our technical producer, and John Roscoe has now come on as our technical producer to run this. And our The idea of hyperlocal literature is a phrase that is used by the editorial board of Textile magazine, which has a diversity mandate for finding and encouraging emerging writers from diverse populations. Mm-hmm. So our slogan at Watershed Writers is read local, think global, right? So we want people to understand that there are writers among us, mm-hmm. working hard and creating excellent literature. Some of it does have a hyper local focus in that I just interviewed David Waltner Taves, who is an internationally renowned epidemiologist and veterinarian, and he's also a poet, right? And he's written a memoir about raising backyard chickens, which is hilarious and scientific and poetic and everything, yeah. Right? And they're based on, the chickens he had in his backyard in Kitchener. So we have that hyperlocal focus. And then, we have people like Tasneem Jamal, who was nominated for a number of awards for her book, Where the Air is Sweet, which is about her family's migration from Uganda right after the sort of the crisis precipitated by Idi Amin, who didn't want any more East Indian families there, and said it was Africa for Africans, and they should get out. And she and her family migrated to Kitchener and have lived here ever since. So we've got these sometimes very, very global stories and sometimes very, very local stories. And I think there's room for all of it.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's a delight to see, because, we started sort of pursuing writers that I knew from the community. And the more I do this, the more I discover more and more and more writers. Mm-hmm. There's a ton of us out here. And so it's been a journey of discovery for me, because I'm like, hi, and now I have to do things like, hi, I don't know you, and I've heard you have a book out. Can you tell me about it? And do you want to come on the show? Right. Yeah. As opposed to, saying to Aaron Bowe, who I've known for, more than a decade, Aaron, come on my new show. Right. So that's very different.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good, because then you're not just relying on your close knit friends. You're inherently sort of expanding that network of writers.
Yeah. And that was a concern at first, because I thought, I have to, if I'm not using this to discover where other writers are, I'm not doing my job.
Yeah.
So it's fine to lean on people I knew for, a few shows per season, but like, it just can't be, writers that Tanis knows. It has to be,
right.
It has to be more than that.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So let's talk about your latest book. It's called Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. And it's a collection of essays about the importance of walking, being female while doing it, and the social commentary that emerges from it. How did that book come about, and what are some of your favorite takeaways from it?
I wanted to write a book that I hadn't been seeing very much of, and of course I did a lot of research, and it turns out there's more out there than I thought, but still not enough. So I was reading a lot of books about walking, since I've always been a big walker, and since I was diagnosed with both sciatica and degenerative disc disease, my walking cannot be as athletic as it used to be, nor as I cannot do 10,000 steps a day. Like, that is just absolutely not in my wheelhouse. I shouldn't do 10,000 steps a day, or else I wouldn't be able to do anything else. I would be effectively laid out. So I was interested in the idea of what happens when we're ambulatory, and also what happens when we're ambulatory and walking differently. Limping, walking slowly. Also, what happens when we stop walking and look up and observe something, as birders often do, right? What happens just when we pass through space, and there's something political, of course, in occupying a space, especially, a space that is, as a semi-groomed space, like a conservation area that claims to be for everyone, and yet it isn't really, right? And of course, I was interested in gender and walking, in what it means for a woman to be alone in the woods. right?
Mm-hmm.
And by woods, I do mean the woods near my place, not a jungle or an especially wild space,
Mm-hmm.
but something that is wild enough to have a lot of cover,
Mm-hmm.
wild enough to have accidents happen in it, wild enough to not see the person creeping up on you if there is a person creeping up on you,
Right.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to address all of these political things about walking beyond the idea of health and welfare and athleticism and achievement. I thought, what if an achievement is walking 500 yards away from your house and 500 yards back? Because on a bad day, that is an achievement for me.
Absolutely.
And there's lots of people who live like that. And you're not supposed to talk about the pain of walking sometimes, or you're not supposed to talk about being afraid to walk sometimes. You're not supposed to talk about the politics of those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly it's not only women. Of course, BIPOC people have their own take on this as well. I try to fold that in a little bit, although I'm not a person of color, and I'm not Indigenous, and I'm not Black, and I think I can't speak from those perspectives. But someone like Drew Lanham, who is a professor of, I think he's a professor of ornithology in the Southern United States, has a great book called The Home Place, and he is the author of a listicle called 8 Rules for the Black Birder, right? In which he outs bird watching, the mostly white, mostly male, mostly middle-aged population of bird watchers, as a kind of an exclusive club. And he said one thing about being a Black bird watcher is that people will always mistake you for the other Black bird watcher, right? So he says that if there are 50 people out bird watching in a bird sanctuary one day, he was always getting called by someone else's name because there were only 2 male Black bird watchers there, right? So. And he too talks about loving something that could lead to violence. That when he goes into the woods and he's a Black man alone in the woods, that there's like historical violence, right? There's also historical refuge, right? But both of those things sit together, right? And so I wanted to think about that in terms of gender, right? And so that's Straggle. So I have some very, very short sort of poem-like essays and some much longer, more research-based essays. And it's been very interesting touring with this book.
Yeah.
I was selling it once at a book festival, and a young woman comes up and she's looking at it. And I said, so that's a book about the politics and the pleasures of walking. And she looked at me and I said, you know what I mean, right? And she went, I so know. She was about 19, right?
Wow.
And she's like, here's the money. I so know, right? So I think it's one of those, if you know books, right? That if I have to explain the premise that it is dangerous for women to walk in particular places, if I have to be convincing about that, this is not the book for you. Or maybe it is the book for you, but is generally not who I wrote it for.
Right.
I wrote it for that young woman who said, I so know. Right.
Right. You can commiserate, or maybe you just need to read it, basically. Yeah. That's excellent. Well, Tennis, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Bill.
You just heard from Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, and author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.